The scorching Arizona sun beat down mercilessly as Josephine Nielson clutched her wailing infant to her chest, the wagon wheels behind her still spinning lazily in the dust, all that remained of the life she desperately tried to build. Her husband's body lay 3 miles back, victim to a Comanche raid that had left her fleeing on foot across the unforgiving desert with nothing but the clothes on her back and her 3-month-old daughter. "Hush now, Ellie," she whispered, her cracked lips barely able to form the words. "Please, baby, please be quiet." But the infant only wailed louder, her tiny face red with hunger and thirst. Josephine hadn't eaten in 2 days, and her milk was drying up. The terrible truth was settling in her stomach like a stone. They were both going to die out here. She stumbled forward, her vision blurring as the distant mountains wavered in the heat. The baby's cries grew weaker, which frightened Josephine more than the screaming had. She fell to her knees, no longer able to support her own weight, and curled protectively around her child. "I'm sorry," she whispered, tears cutting clean tracks through the dust on her face. "I'm so sorry, my sweet girl." The sound of hoofbeats barely registered in her fading consciousness. Perhaps it was death approaching, she thought, or maybe Indians returning to finish what they'd started. She didn't have the strength to run anymore. She only held her baby tighter, shielding the infant with her body. "Madam." The voice was deep, concerned. "American. Madam, can you hear me?" Rough hands gently turned her over, and Josephine forced her eyes open to see a man's face silhouetted against the bright sky. A cowboy, with a weathered face and kind eyes that crinkled with concern. "Water," she managed to rasp. "Here." He uncorked a canteen and lifted it to her lips. The water was warm, but felt like heaven as it trickled down her parched throat. The baby's weak cries grew more insistent. The man's gaze shifted to the bundle in her arms. "Your little one sounds mighty hungry," he said, his voice soft with compassion. "No milk," Josephine whispered, shame and desperation washing over her. "No food for days." Without hesitation, the cowboy reached down and gathered both Josephine and the baby into his strong arms. He held them close against his chest, and Josephine felt the steady rhythm of his heartbeat against her cheek. The baby's cries softened slightly at the new warmth surrounding them. "You're safe," he whispered, his breath stirring the hair at her temple. "Both of you. You're safe now." Those were the last words Josephine heard before darkness claimed her. When she awoke, she was lying on a real bed in a small but tidy cabin. Panic seized her chest as she realized her baby wasn't in her arms. "Ellie," she cried out, struggling to sit up. "She's right here, madam," came that same deep voice. The cowboy appeared in the doorway, her daughter cradled expertly in one arm, while he held a small cup in his other hand. "Been feeding her some goat's milk." She took to it real well. Relief flooded through Josephine as she saw her daughter's peaceful face, no longer contorted with hunger. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm Josephine Nielson. My husband." Her voice caught on the words. "I'm Rylan Zachary," he replied, sitting carefully on the edge of the bed and passing the now sleeping infant to her waiting arms. "And I figured about your husband when I found your wagon back a ways." "I'm sorry, madam." Josephine held her daughter close, breathing in her sweet scent. "The Comanche came so suddenly. Thomas told me to run while he—" She couldn't finish. "You're safe here," Rylan said simply. "My ranch isn't much, but there's food and shelter for as long as you need it." "Why would you help strangers this way?" Josephine asked, studying his face. He was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 30, with sun-darkened skin and eyes the color of the sky just before dusk. Rylan shrugged and stood up. "Out here, we look after each other. It's the only way to survive." He moved toward the door. "Rest now. We'll talk more when you're stronger." Over the next few days, Josephine recovered her strength. Rylan's ranch was modest but well kept, with a small herd of cattle, several horses, and a garden that provided fresh vegetables. He lived alone, she learned, though he employed 2 Mexican brothers who helped with the cattle and slept in the bunkhouse some distance from the main cabin. Josephine insisted on earning her keep as soon as she was able. She took over the cooking and mending, grateful for the opportunity to be useful. Rylan was patient with Ellie, seemingly unbothered by her occasional fussing. He'd fashioned a small cradle from a wooden crate, lining it with soft blankets. "You're good with her," Josephine remarked one evening as Rylan gently rocked Ellie while Josephine prepared dinner. Had for younger siblings, he said with a small smile. Ma needed the help. Where are they now? Your family. A shadow passed over his face. Back east. Pennsylvania. Farm couldn't support us all, so I headed west 10 years ago. Do you write to them? When I can. I'm not much for letters. He looked down at Ellie, who had wrapped her tiny hand around his finger. What about you? Do you have family somewhere? Josephine shook her head. My parents died of fever when I was 16. Thomas was all I had. She swallowed hard. We were headed to California. He had a cousin there who offered him work. California's still there, Rylan said quietly. When you're ready. But as the days turned into weeks, Josephine found herself less eager to continue the journey. The ranch began to feel like home, and Rylan's quiet strength became something she depended on. He never pressed her about her plans, content to let her stay as long as she needed. Spring was turning to summer when tragedy struck again. Josephine was hanging laundry when she heard shouts from the cattle pasture. She looked up to see Rylan being thrown from his horse, which had stepped into a prairie dog hole. Even from a distance, she could tell he was badly hurt. With Ellie strapped to her chest, Josephine ran to where Rylan lay unconscious, blood seeping from a gash on his head. With the help of the ranch hands, they carried him back to the cabin and placed him on his bed. Miguel, ride for the doctor in town, Josephine ordered, already tearing strips of cloth for bandages. Diego, bring me hot water and whiskey. For 3 days, Rylan drifted in and out of consciousness while Josephine tended to him. The doctor had come and gone, leaving little hope. That skull fracture is bad, he'd said grimly. If he wakes, he might not be the same man. But Josephine refused to give up. She bathed his fevered brow, spooned broth between his lips, and spoke to him constantly, telling him about Ellie's latest accomplishments and the state of the ranch. At night, she slept in a chair beside his bed, one hand always resting on his arm. On the 4th night, she awoke to find him watching her, his blue eyes clear for the first time since the accident. You're still here, he whispered. Tears sprang to her eyes. Where else would I be? Thought I dreamed you, he said, his voice weak but steady. You and the little one. We're real, she assured him, taking his hand. And we're not going anywhere until you're better. Recovery was slow, but by midsummer, Rylan was back on his feet, though he tired easily and suffered from occasional headaches. During his convalescence, Josephine had taken over management of the ranch, learning quickly and earning the respect of the ranch hands. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Ellie sleeping peacefully in her cradle beside them, Rylan turned to Josephine. You saved the ranch, he said simply. And you saved me. Josephine shook her head. I only repaid the debt I owed you. You saved us first, remember? There's no debt between us, Josie. It was the first time he'd used the diminutive of her name, and it sent a pleasant warmth through her chest. But there is something I need to say. She waited, suddenly nervous. I know you had plans to go to California, he continued, his eyes on the distant mountains. And if that's still what you want, I'll help you get there safely. But, he hesitated, then turned to look at her directly. But I've grown mighty fond of you and Ellie. The place feels like a home with you here. I guess what I'm trying to say is, I'd be honored if you'd consider staying. Permanently. Josephine's heart pounded in her chest. Are you asking me to marry you, Rylan Zachary? A slow smile spread across his face. I reckon I am, Josephine Nielson, though I'm making a poor job of it. She reached out and took his hand, her own smile blooming. Then I reckon my answer is yes. They were married 2 weeks later by the circuit preacher, with Ellie dressed in a gown Josephine had sewn from one of her own dresses. The ranch hands served as witnesses, and the celebration afterward was simple but joyful. That night, after Ellie was asleep in her cradle, Rylan took Josephine's hand and led her to what was now their bedroom. His kiss was gentle at first, then deepened with a hunger that matched her own. They came together as if they'd always belonged to each other, their bodies speaking the love words they were still learning to say aloud. Afterward, as they lay entwined in the moonlight streaming through the window, Josephine traced the scar on Rylan's temple with gentle fingers. I never thought I'd find love again, she whispered. After Thomas, I thought that part of my life was over. Rylan caught her hand and brought it to his lips. Life out here is hard, Josie, but it's also full of unexpected blessings. You and Ellie are mine. As summer turned to fall, their happiness only grew. Rylan legally adopted Ellie, who was now crawling and babbling, her sunny personality bringing joy to everyone on the ranch. The cattle business was thriving, and they were able to hire additional hands. But the harsh realities of frontier life were never far away. In late October, word came that a gang of outlaws was moving through the territory, robbing isolated ranches and leaving few survivors. Rylan increased the guard on the herd and made sure Josephine knew how to use his Winchester rifle. "I won't let anything happen to you or Ellie," he promised, checking the ammunition for the third time. "We'll protect each other," Josephine replied firmly. She was no longer the frightened widow he'd found in the desert. Months of ranch life had made her strong and capable. The attack came just before dawn on a cold November morning. Josephine was awakened by the sound of gunfire and men shouting. Rylan was already out of bed, pulling on his boots. "Stay here with Ellie," he ordered, grabbing his rifle. "Barricade the door behind me." Rylan, no, but he was already gone, slipping out into the darkness. Josephine quickly checked on Ellie, who was miraculously still asleep, then dragged a heavy chest in front of the door. She loaded the shotgun Rylan had left for her and positioned herself at the window, her heart pounding. She could see shadowy figures moving around the barn and the orange glow of flames beginning to lick at the structure. More gunshots rang out, and she saw Rylan and the ranch hands taking cover behind the water trough, returning fire. For what seemed like hours, the battle raged. Then, to her horror, she saw Rylan fall. Without thinking, she moved the chest and ran outside, shotgun in hand. One of the outlaws spotted her and raised his pistol, but before he could fire, Josephine pulled the trigger. The man dropped to the ground. The remaining outlaws, seeing that the ranch was better defended than they'd anticipated, began to retreat. Josephine rushed to Rylan's side, terrified of what she might find. He was alive, blood soaking his left sleeve where a bullet had grazed him, but otherwise unharmed. He looked up at her with a mixture of anger and admiration. "I told you to stay inside," he growled, letting her help him to his feet. "And let them kill you? Not a chance," she retorted, supporting his weight as they made their way back to the cabin. Diego had been shot in the leg, but would recover. The barn was damaged but not destroyed, and none of the livestock had been lost. As Josephine bandaged Rylan's arm, she couldn't stop her hands from shaking. "Hey," he said softly, catching her trembling fingers in his good hand. "We're okay. You were braver than any man I've ever known." She looked up at him, tears in her eyes. "I couldn't bear to lose you, Rylan. Not after everything we've been through." He pulled her close, burying his face in her hair. "You won't lose me, Josie. I promise." The winter that followed was one of the harshest in memory. Snow piled high around the cabin, and the cattle huddled together for warmth in the sheltered areas of the pasture. But inside, the Zachary home was warm and filled with love. Ellie took her first steps on Christmas Day, toddling unsteadily from Josephine to Rylan, who scooped her up with a whoop of delight. "She's going to be running the ranch before we know it," he laughed, tossing her gently in the air while she giggled. Josephine watched them, her heart so full it almost hurt. She placed a hand on her still flat stomach, wondering when the right moment would be to tell Rylan about the new life growing inside her. She chose that evening, after Ellie was asleep and they sat before the fire, his arm around her shoulders. "I have a Christmas gift for you," she said softly, "though it won't arrive until summer." It took him a moment to understand, but when he did, his face transformed with wonder. "A baby? Our baby." She nodded, laughing as he pulled her into a fierce embrace. "Are you happy?" she asked, though she could see the answer in his eyes. "Happier than I ever thought possible," he answered, his voice thick with emotion. "When I found you in the desert that day, I had no idea I was finding my whole future." Spring brought new life to the ranch. Calves were born, the garden began to produce, and Josephine's belly grew round with their child. Ellie, now a sturdy toddler of 18 months, followed Rylan everywhere, her little boots leaving tracks alongside his in the mud. Word came that the outlaws who had attacked them had been caught and hanged in Santa Fe. The territory was growing more civilized, with new settlers arriving every month. Rylan talked of expanding the ranch, perhaps building a larger house in a few years. With a proper room for Ellie and one for the new baby, he said, sketching out his ideas on a piece of paper one evening. And maybe more children after that. Josephine smiled, loving the picture he painted of their future. As many as God sees fit to give us, she agreed. In June, just as the wildflowers were painting the hills with color, their son was born. They named him Thomas Rylan Zachary, honoring both Josephine's first husband and his new father. He has your eyes, Josephine said tiredly, watching as Rylan cradled the newborn with practiced ease. And your spirit, I'll wager, Rylan replied, his voice soft with awe. He'll need it out here. Ellie was fascinated by her baby brother, constantly wanting to touch his tiny fingers and toes. Baby, she would say solemnly, patting his head with surprising gentleness. As Josephine recovered from the birth, she often thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. The terrible loss that had sent her fleeing across the desert, the miraculous rescue by a lonely cowboy, and the love that had grown between them, steady and strong as the mountains on the horizon. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Ellie playing with her wooden horse at their feet and baby Thomas nursing at Josephine's breast, Rylan took her free hand in his. Do you ever think about what might have happened if I hadn't been riding that trail that day? He asked. If I hadn't found you and Ellie? Josephine shuddered slightly. I try not to. We were so close to. She couldn't finish the sentence. Rylan nodded, his thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand. I wasn't even supposed to be out that way. I was looking for a stray heifer. Just chance, really. Not chance, Josephine said firmly. Providence. He smiled at that. Maybe so. All I know is, when I saw you lying there in the dust, something told me my whole life was about to change. Was it for the better? She teased, knowing the answer but wanting to hear it anyway. Rylan looked around at their home, at Ellie who was now climbing onto his lap, at the baby in Josephine's arms, and finally at Josephine herself, his eyes full of a love that still took her breath away. It was everything, he said simply. You gave me everything I never knew I needed. 5 years later, the Zachary Ranch had grown into one of the most prosperous in the territory. The small cabin had been replaced by a comfortable 2-story house, with room for their family that now included 4 children. Ellie, Thomas, 3-year-old Sarah, and baby James, just 6 months old. Josephine stood on the front porch, watching as Rylan taught Ellie to ride her own pony, his patient instructions carrying across the yard. Thomas ran alongside, begging for his turn, while Sarah played with her rag doll in the shade of a cottonwood tree. Sometimes, Josephine still had nightmares about those desperate days in the desert, the hunger and fear that had nearly claimed both her and Ellie's lives. But they were becoming less frequent, replaced by the rich tapestry of memories she and Rylan had created together. Their love had been forged in the harshest conditions the frontier could offer, tested by outlaws and accidents, strengthened by childbirth and the daily challenges of ranch life. It wasn't the future she had imagined when she and Thomas had set out for California all those years ago, but it was a future filled with more joy than she had ever thought possible. As if sensing her thoughts, Rylan looked up and caught her eye across the yard. He said something to Ellie, then handed the pony's reins to one of the ranch hands and made his way toward the house. Penny for your thoughts, Mrs. Zachary, he asked, climbing the steps to stand beside her. Josephine smiled up at him, still finding the same thrill in his presence that she had when they first married. Just counting my blessings. Rylan wrapped an arm around her waist, pulling her close to his side as they watched their children play in the golden afternoon light. Remember what I whispered to you that first day? He asked. When you and Ellie were both so broken and afraid? Josephine nodded, the memory vivid despite the years that had passed. You said we were safe. And you are, he said, pressing a kiss to her temple. Always will be, as long as I'm breathing. I know, she replied softly. That's why I stopped running that day. Something in your voice made me believe you. Baby James began to cry from his cradle inside the house, and Josephine moved to go to him. Rylan caught her hand before she could step away. I love you, Josie, he said, his eyes serious. More today than yesterday, and not as much as tomorrow. She rose on tiptoe to kiss him, her heart as full as it had ever been. And I love you, Rylan Zachary. My cowboy, my rescuer, my home. As she went inside to tend to their youngest son, Josephine sent up a silent prayer of gratitude for the twist of fate that had brought Rylan riding across her path that desperate day. Life on the frontier was still hard, still dangerous, but facing it with him by her side made all the difference. That night, with the children asleep and the ranch quiet under a blanket of stars, Rylan and Josephine sat on their porch swing, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting against his chest. No words were needed as they rocked gently back and forth, listening to the night sounds of the land they both loved. Their story had begun with hunger, fear, and a whispered promise of safety. It had grown into something neither of them could have imagined, a love strong enough to withstand whatever the untamed West might throw at them, and a family that was their greatest achievement. As the first light of dawn touched the eastern sky, Josephine turned her face up to Rylan's and smiled. "Another day," she whispered. He nodded, understanding all she meant by those simple words. Another day to love, to work, to build their life together. Another day safe in each other's arms. Another day, he agreed, and kissed her as the sun rose over their home.